little bit of a loner. She had friends, but she didn't always fit in with the typical girl social cues that you would expect, right? Dated some guys, she had some boyfriends, but they never panned out too much. Her parents sent her off to an Ivy League school. They paid for the first year. They got her a nice roommate and a nice dorm. And she seemed to excel in her chosen field of study, but she tended to make friends who started to use words that the parents hadn't really heard before. Words like transgender, words like gender identity, words like gender dysphoria. And so she comes home and she tells her parents, I think though my body says I'm a girl, I don't feel like it. I feel like I fit in better as a guy. Her parents wanted to be accepting, they wanted to be caring, they wanted to understand her struggles, her problems, her worries. They paid for her to go to a therapist, they paid for her to go to counseling, they paid for her to be on antidepressants, and for a time, for a couple of months the next year at college, that worked. And then it didn't work. She began to speak about the desire to change her body, the desire to that is, in essence, as best as medical technology could, to have a double mastectomy, what is called euphemistically top surgery. She began to ask to be referred to as he. She chose a name for herself, and she was infuriated that her parents would refer to her by her dead name, that is, her name, Lucy. And this is not just a story that's one episode out of 2 or 3. This is a story that's going on in houses and in families increasingly across the nation. It's a story that has dominated particularly young women. I have some of the numbers here in your outline. In 2018, the United Kingdom reported a 4,400% rise over the previous decade in teenage girls seeking gender treatments. In the U.S., adolescent gender dysphoria, and we'll define that term, don't worry, adolescent gender dysphoria has increased by over 1,000%. There is an epidemic today in our families, in our land, in our culture, of confusion about what it means to be and means to feel like you're trapped in the wrong body. Now, we've looked. This is the last week, okay? I've received a few comments from y'all, a few questions about, well, you've been talking the past 3 weeks or so, Pastor John, about all this cultural stuff, all this intellectual stuff. When are we going to get to hear what we have to do? How do we respond to this? And I understand that. You want the answer. But part of the reason why this is the last week and we're spending 4 weeks on this is you need to understand, I want you to understand, to be forewarned, to be aware of what's happening in the wider world so that we can respond truly and honestly as Christians ought to respond. So don't worry, starting next week, we're going to move into prescription. We're going to move from description, what is happening in the world today, what has happened over history, into, okay, now what as Christians, how ought we to respond? So we'll get into that next week. And as you have questions, of course, write them down and we'll raise your hand and we'll seek to answer them. But today we come to what I've called, and I'm just, again, using Carl Trueman's words here, the triumph of the T. That is the triumph of transgender. Not simply as a feeling, but as an ideology. And before we get into that, I'm going to spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes to give you a little bit of a history of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans movement. And you may say, well, why are we having this at church? Why are we going over this? This is an icky topic. This is a yucky topic. I don't want to hear about this. And the problem is, if you don't hear about the history, you're going to hear about it from somebody else. Somebody else is going to tell you a history, and well, they may not have your best interest in mind. They may not come at it from a Christian perspective. And so my goal here is to give us very briefly a little history of what has become a political, unlikely alliance and movement. A community that really should not exist together has come to exist together primarily because of politics. So in this movement, right, you have the T for trans, L, lesbian, G, gay, and B for bisexual. And there are other letters that you can add to this, and Q is often added for queer, and we don't need to get into all the details, but the point simply is this, that historically speaking, lesbians saw themselves as very different than the classic homosexual male. The lesbian female, until the 80s really, saw herself as something uniquely feminine, not just a female version of a homosexual disease or problem, not just the girl variant, not just the girl version, but as you read the writings of someone like Germaine Greer, actually, someone who is attracted to women is experiencing the world from a uniquely female perspective. This is something that is different. And yet, in the 1980s, that kind of talk became outlawed. You really didn't talk about it that much in the community, primarily because of one key catalyst, the AIDS crisis, the HIV epidemic. In the 1980s, I don't want to, I think we can very easily forget that in the 1980s, there was a health crisis. I know some of y'all were around then. Some of y'all went through that. You saw it in the news, perhaps. But for many of us, it's a very far removed from our experience, and yet it is the defining moment for an older generation of homosexual activists and homosexual folks. The community itself was defined in many ways by this. And today you see a split between those who went through that, the 80s, and those who didn't. Dramatic split. Now, what did this crisis do? I see. I mentioned here at the bottom of the first page, there's a guy named Bill Krause, a politician in San Francisco, out in California. He was to die of AIDS himself, and he tried to promote better health practices. He recommended that you close the bathhouses in the city, which were the places where uninhibited activity occurred, contact occurred, and yet that was met with opposition from the LGBT movement. As one opponent said, that would give the moral majority the gasoline they've been waiting for to fuel the flames that will annihilate us. The idea that any inhibiting, if you close down these bathhouses, if you close down, you inhibit us in any way from complete and total sexual freedom, even if you're trying to prevent us from dying, that's wrong, because we need to be free. And particularly because that comes from a moralistic, a right-wing, a political perspective. You see here, we've come really to the ultimate point where any sort of sexual activity is not a moral category. This is why when you talk to your neighbors and you say, well, I don't know if you should really be doing that. The Bible says you shouldn't be. This is why they have that argument has no pull, because it's not a moral issue. It's simply what I do. It's not. I'm built this way. Right? It's not a question of morality. And as I mentioned here, if being gay is no longer about sexual activity, but about a community that's gone through a crisis, if it becomes an identity, we've gone through this, we've been oppressed, we've been victimized by those right-wingers or by the government or by what have you, by a traditional culture, then suddenly I'm being attacked because of who I am, not because of what I do. The shift is from the activity, the action, to the identity. That's why there's this weird alliance between these groups that should not necessarily be the case. As I say here, if it's all about who you are, then you are not responsible for your own death any more than you are responsible for the color of your skin. You are a victim. You're a victim simply of being who you are. And what's wrong with being who you are? And therefore, AIDS is not a moral crisis, but a technical crisis. That's why you need to pursue a cure. That's why you need to be safe. And that's all you need to do. You don't need to change anything about who you are, necessarily. Now, beginning in the 2000s and supremely with Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner, as he wishes to be called, you have really the emergence of another ally, another part of the movement. The T joins. And again, I want to see that this is not simply a new thing. It is the ultimate endpoint of what's been happening to all of us for hundreds of years. This is why Bruce Jenner says in his interview that he makes with Cosmo, with Vanity Fair, he says, "I was living a lie. I was living a lie for so many years. Bruce was living a lie, but now I'm free. I was pretending to be somebody else, but now I'm following my inner psychological convictions." You see, psychology trumps biology. Psychology trumps cultural norms. I'm free to be authentic. I'm free to be who I am. Now, of course, part of the problem is that a view of yourself as gay or lesbian requires that you believe in a man and a woman, right? I'm a man, I'm attracted to men. I'm a woman, I'm attracted to women. That assumes there are two. As we've been saying, we call that the gender binary. However, with the introduction of the T, suddenly gender becomes free-floating. There's no longer two. There are varieties. There's a whole host of options available. There are a whole host of genders. And this is a huge problem if you're a girl, if you're a feminist, if you're a lesbian. That's why Germaine Greer says this is that someone who is transgender is actually operating under a man's view of what a girl is like. If you're a guy and you say, well, I feel like I'm a woman, what does that tend to look like? What can look like dressing like a woman. It can look like wanting to be referred to in your pronouns as she or her. It can look like taking the name of a woman. And yet Germaine Greer says, and she's by no means a conservative writer, she's as radical as they come, she says this: no so-called sex change has ever begged for a uterus and ovaries transplant. If uterus and ovaries transplants were made mandatory for wannabe women, they would disappear overnight. In other words, she's saying it's a masculine idea of what a woman ought to be, and therefore, she's in huge hot water. A lot of people don't like her because she said this, but it shows actually how very conservative and traditional the view of men wanting to become women is, because their idea of being a woman is very 50s. It's very, 1950s. It's dressing up and wearing makeup and these sort of things. It's often very feminized, which itself is, again, an interesting topic. Now, let's get into actually that was a kind of a more political overview. I don't want to do too much of that. I do want to focus today, however, on gender dysphoria and what that means, and what it means that we have a crisis today in the realm of transgender identity. Before I do, any questions or comments, cares, concerns, pushback? There are actually some. I could recommend later on if you want. There are those who say the same sort of thing, because the reverse is very, being a tomboy is one thing, right? But tomboys are disappearing now. because you're being pushed. As we'll see, teenage girls who like to play with their brothers or play sports or whatever are being pushed towards this instead of being pushed towards alternative routes in today's culture, which is an issue. But we'll get into that. So what does it mean to be a transgendered person, and what is transgenderism? First thing to note here, it's a big term. It's an umbrella term that can refer to a variety of genuine and maybe less genuine realities. Let me start with the genuine reality here. The real problem, and this is a legitimate issue, is something called gender dysphoria. All right, we can't use the blue marker. Gender dysphoria, which is, quote here, the experience of distress associated with the incongruence wherein one's psychological and emotional gender identity does not match one's biological sex. Or to put it in layman's terms, you feel like your body's not who you are. And look, if you're above a certain age, you know what this is like. You know what this is like. Your body's not what it used to be. This is one of the basic points. Every one of us, to a tiny degree or a big degree, suffers from the fact that our bodies are not what we think they are. You know, I've looked in the mirror and I thought I was amazing. And then Alexis says, hold on. What's this? And she's like, I didn't see that until now. I thought I was looking amazing. And then there's that pimple, right? Or there's that ugly feature of myself that I didn't see. Every one of us has, generally to a very tiny degree, but all of us experience an incongruity. We think we're amazing, and we think we can drive all the places, and then we get older, we find we can't drive everywhere. You know, we think we're fit, and then we can't play the sports like we could. I mention that only because this can seem so foreign to us. This can seem such a weird statement. How can somebody think that they're a woman trapped in a man's body, and yet we often think, well, I'm a good-looking guy trapped in, and we find we're trapped in an ugly body. You know, I mention that because one of the crucial responses as Christians we ought to have is actually compassion and understanding for those who do suffer from this. There is a legitimate, non-delusional, non-social, not led by your friends, dysphoria. Now, as I mentioned here, our current studies suggest that between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 13,000 males, between 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 34,000 females have this condition. That's not a lot, okay? It's a very, very, very small portion of society. And you'll note that more guys have it than girls, typically, at least historically, until the last 10 years, generally. Now, why is this the case? Some, of course, argue that nature is the reason, right? Your brain is different. Maybe. It's not been proven. Others argue that, well, you were brought up in an environment. You know, you were brought up in a real man's house, and so you're going to want to be a man. That's your primary feature. That's your primary parenting technique. You see your parents, and your mom's really hardworking, and she's man-like, and you want to be a man. Again, maybe the point is that we have there's no conclusive evidence. We don't know why this occurs. Now, that is the legitimate, I think we can say as Christians, a fallen condition. Part of the result of the fall is that our view of ourselves and what we're given does not match up. We think, this is the problem with Eve and Adam. They thought, I can take of the tree. It looks good. What was the problem there? They thought they were equipped. They thought they were too good and that nothing bad would happen if they took of the tree. And so as a result of the fall, we all, in various ways, live with limitations in our ability. We all don't conform to the ideal that Jesus Christ sets. That's the nature of being a Christian. So as you hear about this, I want you to have that in the background. Because we can rush so easily to say, well, that's yuck. yucky. I don't want to hear about that. And as a Christian, we are not to respond the way the culture does. The culture says, the world says, respond with your gut instinct. Respond with how you feel. And if, as Christians, we respond and say, yuck, because it feels icky, that's actually aping the culture and not responding with all the word says, including that we are all made in God's image, including, as we've discussed, that we're all fallen, including that we all need the truth spoken in love. Right, and again, I'm foreshadowing next week and the weeks to come, but I wanted to give you a little bit here so you're not completely, depressed. So, gender dysphoria. Now, in this, we're getting into some terms that I want to give you a little bit of knowledge of because you hear them thrown around a lot nowadays. One of the common questions parents have that I've seen and I've talked with is all these words, all these things coming at me. I don't know what they mean. My kids are talking to me about words, and they're saying, my grandkids are saying things. I have no idea what it sounds so foreign. So let me give you a little bit of a guide here. I have a glossary for you. We'll break it down here a little bit because you need to know this. You need to know some things here. You need to be aware of what's happened. We are the first society in the world to disconnect sex and gender. We're the first society in the world to disconnect these two words. By sex, I mean biological. You're born and you're distinguished as male. You're born, you're distinguished as female. Right? Biologically based. Second, however, has come the notion of what is now called gender. It's the term we use even in this class. It's a class on gender. What does gender mean? Gender is, and this is, I believe, even quoting from the American Psychological Association, the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors associated that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. Right? So the attitudes, the expressions, the behavior, all that you do, all that you say. What is a man, right? So, 50 years ago, what did men do? Well, men smoked a lot, right? The Marlboro Man, that's the idea. You were given the advertisement that said, if you want to be cool, if you want to be the rugged rebel, you're going to smoke Marlboros. Today, men don't smoke. We've changed our cultural perception of what is appropriate, and also ladies generally, don't as well, by and large. Of course, there are exceptions to this. Now, I mentioned here, right? Think of the kilt. I have one of my mentors is a Scottish pastor. He's a great guy, and there's a picture. He showed me a picture in his wedding. His wife is wearing a beautiful wedding dress, and he's wearing a wedding skirt, or what he calls a traditional Scottish kilt. And it's what you do. It's what, if you've seen bagpipers come in, they wear their kilts. And we understand, despite the jokes, that that is what a man wears in traditional Scottish culture. If you were to meet William Wallace, who here likes Braveheart, right? We've seen Braveheart. We know what William Wallace. He's a man. He's not a coward. He's not unmacho. William Wallace wore a kilt, right? He wore a kilt because in Scottish society, to be a man, part of the Scottish masculine gender identity was to wear a kilt. And he conformed to that in his culture. Let me give you another example. Is blue a boy color or a girl color? This is an open question, by the way. Is blue a boy color or a girl color? Yeah. It's popular today for people when they to have a gender reveal party, right? And you have the blue if it's a boy, you have the pink if it's a girl. In the year 1919, 102 years ago, the magazine Good Housekeeping, which still exists today, I think, magazine Good Housekeeping, wrote an article in which it talked about the colors of the season. This is going to be the color of 1919. They had a color for the guys and a color for the girls. The color for the guys was pink. The color for the girls was baby blue. 100 years ago. Cultural publication expressing the idea that pink was a masculine color. Baby blue was a feminine. Again, now 100 years nowadays, it's reversed. What does that indicate? That indicates simply this, that cultural expectations of what it means to be a man and a woman can change over time. That's all. And so there is some truth here to the fact that biologically there are givens, that culturally there are general American cultural givens to what it means to be a man or a woman. Now, of course, there are also biblical givens. We've talked about that a little bit. We'll get into that in later on. But the distinction between sex and gender, typically, if you are a man, you should want to act in ways that are masculine. If you're a woman, you should want to act in ways that are feminine. But we're the first society that instead of going in this direction, we take our cues from our body. Now, we don't do that as much. Now, we are the first generation that can medically at least seek to change that in some ways. That's why we speak today, that you'll hear folks talk about even more and more today about sex assigned at birth. The idea, it's not a term I like to use personally, but the term that's used is that the doctors, the nurses, are really the bad guys because they look at you, your baby boy, and they say, that's a boy. Well, that's not very nice. What if the boy thinks he's a girl? Right? Now, we laugh at this, but as Christians, we ought to actually have a little bit of compassion for folks who suffer through this. Right? There is, today, particularly in the last 18 months, particularly in the last 5 years, a great crisis, particularly among people like Lucy. I mentioned earlier, a great crisis among teenage girls. And this is where we move from what I'll call genuine psychological disease of gender dysphoria, into another psychological issue, another issue which is caused in no small part by anxiety, depression, loneliness, mental anguish, social media, right? As I mentioned here, historically, the notion that your gender doesn't match your sex occurs in about 0.01% of cases in children, mostly boys, almost all boys. And in 70% of the time, you look at your boy, he's playing with Barbies, and you get, why is he playing with Barbies? Where are the Legos? Where are the Tonka trucks? Why the Barbies? And you get upset. Maybe you look at your girl and your little daughter, and she's 3 years old, she's 4 years old, and she's playing with the action figures, and she's following her brothers around. And some parents can worry and say, well, what does this mean for my girl? And yet, in the vast, vast majority of cases, kids outgrow this. It is just a phase. But now, it's not a phase. Now, today, there is, and I would recommend, there's a book by a gal named Abigail Shrier. I have it at home. Abigail Shrier, Shrier. I'm not going to agree with all she says, but I think she raises an alarm that we need to be aware of. Parents, particularly, y'all need to be aware of the fact that clusters of adolescents. There's one high school up in Massachusetts where a whole rash of girls suddenly decided that they needed to get, not just begin to dress like men, American men, not just to get short haircuts, but to not just to be referred to as guys, but to actually go the whole hog and get surgery. Now, why was this? There's some studies done, some research done, interviews with the girls, guys, the students here, And two things came about. One was peer pressure. One was the fact that, well, they're doing this. This is affirmed. It was found that many of the girls came from middle class, upper class backgrounds. They came from progressive households. They came from very free households where the idea that you need to be yourself was promoted, that you're correct in your feelings. But they also didn't have a lot of friends. They had a hard time making. They didn't pick up on the social cues. Teenage folks aren't nice to other teenagers. I had that, right? I was saved from being thrown in a locker one time by a nice fellow middle school student. Chris was his name. He was a nice guy. No relation to our Chris. But were it not for that, I would have experienced middle school trauma, and many people do, many folks do, and particularly socially with gals. But the other factor is the impact of social media. Today, and in the last 18 months, it's been rampant. Teens today spend far less time in person with friends of their own generation. Far less time. This is why anxiety, loneliness, mental illness, we've mentioned this before a couple years ago. The most lonely groups today are middle-aged men and teenage girls. It's a problem. And it's a vital issue. That's why in the weeks to come, we're going to say, okay, what do we do with this? You need to know that this is a live discussion that's happening. That you can go online, you can go on YouTube, and you can watch videos of YouTube influencers, and they will say, just get the surgery. Here's one person, right? Joanne Herman, quote, "I felt like a car running on the wrong kind of gas. I did not fully understand how wrong it was until I replaced testosterone with estrogen when I transitioned genders in 2002. I now have an amazing sense of well-being and harmony that I never knew before. Now my body just hums." You think, what's in the center of that statement? I didn't feel happy. Now I'm happy. I have well-being. Again, these are all about my happiness is the most central thing in my life. If I feel like I have well-being, then I have well-being. I felt this disconnect. I took this hormone, and now I'm better. Even J.K. Rowling, famous author, says this: "If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment as a teen, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred." What a quote, right? What a statement. And what a warning for us that the danger, friends, that we face is that we chuckle about this, right? We joke about, oh, those people, how messed up they must be. That's not a Christian response. That's not the response that a Christian ought to have to mental anguish, whether it's genuine gender dysphoria or whether it's anxiety, whether it's all these sort of things. There ought to be the same kind of sympathy that Christ has when he looks upon the crowds and he sees that they are sheep without a shepherd. But we'll get into that down the road. So what's the reactions that we have here? Closing very briefly, the last page. The reactions that folks have today differ. Some come from the point of view of diversity. Much of the culture around us says that autonomy is the best thing going. Your authentic life, whoever you think you are, you are. So you need to be affirmed, you need to be accepted, you need to be praised. This is why the YouTube videos, that they say only happy things about getting the surgeries, about taking the hormones, about finally being called their right name. And they also say, look, if your parents don't affirm you, lie to them. If your parents don't affirm you, don't tell them about it. Talk to your school, talk to your other people, go around them. And for teenagers who can rebel against their parents, well, this is a great thing, right? It's you're hearing only positive affirmation. Others say, and even as I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, others respond out of disability. Well, this is a psychological malady. This is a problem. This is even a product of the fall. And there's a point to which this is somewhat of a Christian response. But Others, Christians and non-Christians, go from a point of view of duty. Well, you just need to obey. You need to follow what the Word says, or you need just to follow what I tell you to do. You need to refer to everyone by their chosen pronouns, for example. If you don't, you will be condemned. You'll be judged in the court of public opinion. And of course, part of the question that we're going to get into, and I'm going to leave you with this tension. I'm sort of sorry. You got a week to think about it. How ought we, as creatures made in God's image, fallen, redeemed, how ought we on the way to eternal glory respond? How ought we? Because let me conclude where I started. We all have a mismatch. We all have a mismatch between who we think we are and who we really are. That's the nature of pride. That's the nature of sin, is that we think we're God and we're not. We think we're self-sufficient and we think we're sovereign and we're not sovereign. And so how ought we to respond? And I'll leave you with that. I'm not going to give you the answer just yet, but I will give you this quote by Bonhoeffer before he was going to die. He says this. He wrote this in one of his letters. Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, you know, O God, I am yours. And that really is part of the key solution as we close. Where do you find who you are? You find it in God. Where do you find, with all these real, genuine concerns, where do you find yourself? You find yourself in the Lord. But more on that next week. Any questions, comments, cares, concerns? All right, well, Jim, let me ask you to close us in prayer, and then we can prepare for worship. Amen. Thank you all.